They're just balls of light.
All right, broadcasting live from the Napa Valley wine country, just outside the mystical Sonoma Mountains. This is Beyond the Strange. I am your host, Dave Cruz. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It is Monday, November 22nd, 2021, the year of our Lord. We've got a great show for you guys tonight. Tonight we have Peter Muse, who is an author, and we're going to be really getting into some good stuff tonight. Peter is from the New England area, or we're going to be talking about the New England area, I should say. Mainly going to be the concentration of tonight's topics. So, yeah, it's going to be a fantastic one. So we're going to get Peter on in a second. But first, please go to beyondthestrange.com, register your free monthly newsletter to stay in the know for the show. And also, please follow me, Dave Cruz, on Twitter at StrangeDave70 and Russ Bailey at BSky_paranormal. That's BSKY_paranormal. And remember to go to the Beyond the Strange crew, Beyonders crew on Facebook, and join the rest of the Beyonders on Facebook. There, Russ Bailey is the admin. And yeah, you definitely want to do that. Also, you can follow the show on Twitter at Strange Days 2015. That's Strange Days 2015. Sorry, I know I sound a little hurried, but we got a lot to get to with Peter, so I definitely want to make sure we get everything going quickly as possible. We do have a Discord chat as well. It is the Strange Chat, the official Beyond the Strange Discord channel. All you got to do is go to beyondthestrange.com. At the top of the browser there, you'll see a bunch of links, and one of them is for the chat. So that's what we do when we're not listening to the show. We're hanging out at Beyond the Strange official chat room, Discord, the Strange Chat Room. Okay. Also, don't forget to go to the website, and you want to subscribe to the newsletter, and definitely want to get that going on. I believe we got one more coming out maybe at the end, before the end of the month. If not, we'll get it before or after at the beginning of December. Okie dokie. That's pretty much it. There won't be a show next week, just for quick announcements. We have rescheduled that show, and in December we have our shows will come back on Monday in December, along with the PAP shows on Wednesday nights. And that's pretty much all I have as far as the announcements go. And I will turn it over to Mr. Russ Bailey. Russ, how you doing, my brother?
I'm doing great. How's everyone tonight? Great to see everybody dwindling into the chat. We got Dragon Rose and Jose so far in the Twitch chat. Great to see everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. We've got an awesome show for you tonight.
Fantastic show for you guys tonight. And we will also see those people dwindling also over to the YouTube channel as well. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so let's get to it. We have author Peter Muse with degrees in anthropology from Bates College and Brandeis University, has been exploring New England legends, folklore, and weird traditions for 20 years. He's been blogging at New England Folklore since 2008, and he is the author of Legends and Lore of the North Shore. And his recent work has also appeared in Sam Baltruse's 13 Most Haunted Crime Scenes Beyond Boston. Peter has appeared as a guest expert on the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the museum, and I believe you can find more of Peter if you go to Facebook and look for Peter Muse. I could be getting that wrong, but nevertheless, we have Peter Muse joining us. And Peter, I hope I'm saying your last name right.
Yeah, Muse. My last name is Muse. She's perfect.
Awesome. Right on. Thanks
I
for joining
also
us tonight.
recently had a book come out on September 1st. It was just published by Globe Pequot, and that book is Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts. So that one just came out in September, and you can get that wherever you buy books: Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes and Noble, Bookshop.org. Any place will have that online. So I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. We're happy to have you tonight. So, Peter, tell us a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind. How did you get into this craziness that we all talk about, the paranormal, supernatural, urban legends, folklore, all that good stuff?
Sure. So I grew up in the 1970s. I was born in the late 60s, grew up in the 1970s. In the 1970s, a lot of sort of paranormal and weird phenomena started to appear in pop culture. So things like the In Search Of show with Leonard Nimoy appeared on TV. Shows about Bigfoot, like Bigfoot was on the $6 Million Man. In Search Of Bigfoot. Episode. Yeah, exactly. Right. He not only was he Bigfoot, he was a robot and an alien at the same time. So it was amazing. Shows about the Bermuda Triangle, books about those sorts of things were all kind of out there in the ethos at the time. And so I absorbed a lot of that stuff. And I had an older brother who was 3 years older than me. And he was really into a lot of that also, particularly like UFOs, Bigfoot, Bermuda Triangle, all those things. So I kind of grew up with a lot of that in my brain. At the same time, I was also kind of the nerdy kid who liked mythology and folklore a lot. So like Greek mythology, Norse mythology, King Arthur, all those things. I was really into that. So, I went to college, I studied anthropology. In anthropology, I also enjoy like learning about world mythology, folklore studies, things like that. And so really, but when I left college, and I was probably in my mid to late 20s or so, I realized I didn't know much about the folklore and legends of the place I lived my whole life. Really, I didn't know much about like the folklore and legends of Massachusetts and New England. So I just started to research those things, look into them, and I've never stopped since then. So it's been going on for a long time. I started to write a blog in 2008, newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com, and people can go there and see what I've written. That I've updated that blog several times a month for the last 13 years. So there's a lot of information on that blog also. And so at some point I wrote a couple books also just because I had so many weird stories in my head I wanted to share. And what do you do with them? You write them down so other people can read them and take them in. So it's kind of my background, I guess, and that's how I got involved.
It's fantastic. Almost sounds like me in a way. And that's kind of what I got into doing this show, is from all the strangeness that I watched growing up as a kid. And, you mentioned a lot of the shows that I listened to and watched, and, especially with In Search Of. And I remember the Bermuda Triangle was one of my favorite, episodes of In Search Of, along with Loch Ness Monster.
Yes.
Just great stuff like that. But it's so cool that he brought up the $6 Million Man episode with Bigfoot.
Yeah, bionic Bigfoot from space, right? Amazing.
So. That was cool. That was really cool.
Wasn't that the one where Andre the Giant was playing Bigfoot?
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot to recommend there. A lot to recommend on that episode.
Oh yeah.
So that's where I came from. It's interesting. Like there were a lot of those movies and TV shows out at the time. Some of them are kind of bad. Like I can remember going to see In Search of Noah's Ark with my parents and my brother, which I just, even when I was like, however old I was, 10, I was like, well, this is not a good movie, right? It was just not well done. It was kind of cheesy. But then like some of those other shows really freaked me out and really kind of got under my skin. Like shows like, I don't remember if you remember a show called Project Blue Book, which was just like these two Air Force guys who go out and investigate UFO sightings. In each episode, they would sort of recreate a UFO sighting, and the two Air Force guys would either like debunk it or say, oh, we don't know what happened, right? But the recreations always really got under my skin because they're very creepy. It's always like someone driving a car down a road late at night and suddenly they see something strange and, it's an alien or whatever. And sort of that idea of like seeing this strange, unusual thing has really stuck under my skin and still is with me, whether it's whether those things are really what you think they are or not, but I think it's just that experience of seeing the strange, unusual thing is kind of at the heart of a lot of this, you know?
Yeah, I think it's a shame that they canceled it after 2 seasons, I think, right?
Yeah, I think so.
It was really done well. I love timepieces like that too. And that era, that time that it was in, was like the like the 50s, kind of getting up there to
Yeah.
the 60s, and
Right.
it shows it kind of shows a piece of nostalgia, if you will. I really thought that was really cool. It was a good show. It was a really good show. It's too bad. X-Files was good too. Have you ever watched Fringe?
I never watched Fringe. I watched a few seasons of X-Files. I never watched Fringe.
My friend, you have to watch Fringe.
Okay.
Yeah. I am not kidding. You have got to, as soon as you start and give it at least 4 episodes before you give up. Okay.
Okay.
Because I do that with every show. Sometimes it only takes one for me to get hooked, but I usually give 4 episodes before I just throw in the towel. But Fringe was fantastic. You're gonna love it. As soon as you watch it, you're gonna love it. I
All
know
right.
it.
I'll look into that one.
Yeah. So it's pretty amazing.
Dave, we got a comment from Mike's Moon Bases in the YouTube chat. Thank you for joining us tonight, Mike's.
Thanks,
or
Mike.
Miles. I'm sorry, Miles Moon Bases.
Or Miles.
Yeah. He said Unsolved Mysteries was my favorite from back
Another
before
good
the
one.
cable days, which I agree. And honestly, that's where I first heard about Whitley Strieber's Communion. Was Unsolved Mysteries, the episode of that. And let me tell you, that episode didn't really give me nightmares, but it creeped me out so much I slept with the light on in my bedroom for 2 weeks. Because of abductions.
Yeah.
It was so wild, man. But me myself, growing up, I used to catch when I was a kid. I'd be down at my grandparents' house, and they had cable down there, and TBS. Sometimes during the summer, they would play like these afternoon movies. They were kind of like pseudo documentaries about like UFOs, Bermuda Triangles, ghosts, stuff like that. Always piqued my interest, and then it's something I've always been really fascinated in. Sightings was another great show back in the day, back in the 90s. I love that show also.
Yep, Sightings was pretty good. I remember that. What was I going to say? So, you've been in the New England area pretty much, most of your life?
Most of my life, yeah. I lived in New York State for one summer, but that's about it. And I've traveled lots of places, but I've lived here my whole life, mostly in Massachusetts. Went to college in Maine, traveled around this area. But yeah, I love it here. It's a lot of great stories, a lot of great legends, a lot of weird history. One thing I always like to point out to people is that like the 3 most important horror writers kind of all came from New England. So Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston. He grew up here. And then he left when he was a young man because it was such a it was a very uptight conservative city at the time. So he just couldn't take it. He went south, right?
Sure.
So he was one. H.P. Lovecraft grew up in Rhode Island. Important writer, kind of controversial guy, right? A little bit, had some distasteful opinions, but he grew up in Rhode Island. And then Stephen King is from Maine. So it's like you have these 3 people all with these very influential writers in the horror field, all from such a small part of the country. And I kind of want, like, why is that? And is New England somehow stranger than other parts of the country? Or does it just have a reputation of being stranger? I don't know. But I feel like there's something there that would give birth to that sort of artistic expression from one small area, It's not just a coincidence, I don't think.
I was waiting for you to say Stephen King. And as a matter of fact, this morning on AMC channel, they were showing Stand By Me. And
oh, yeah.
It's funny because that's like the only movie that is not scary to me at all. I mean, it's not a scary movie. It's just, it's another timepiece. It's like 50s, kind of 50s, 60s growing up, coming of age or whatever type movie. But then you have, this dead body, and then, you have, the drama involved in that. I think it's more like it could be thriller. It could be a thriller, but it was definitely a lot different from some of the other a lot of the other
Yeah,
Stephen King
it's more
movies.
about the kids. That one is just more about the kids, right? But then if you take those kids from Stand By Me and add in like a murderous, demonic clown, then you have it basically.
There
like,
you go.
Matches those pieces. Like, okay, take those kids, add a clown. We're gonna call it it.
Yeah, and that was scary. That was good.
That was a scary one.
That was really good.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the remakes of it, and I like that chapter too. That was really good too. They're really, really, really great for Halloween time. But Stephen King, honestly, and just Maine in general, they say that's one of the creepiest states you could ever go to. There's so much folklore and a lot of haunted activity up there. I don't know if you've Peter. I don't know if you've seen the web series called Haunt Me, but they do a lot of their investigations in Maine. Most recently this season, which the season finale is tomorrow night, they actually went to the Hinsdale House in New York. So New England, I think, really with where it's so old and one of the first places to be settled in America. I mean, just a lot of history there and a lot of energy, I think, honestly.
Yeah. I think, like this is one of the oldest parts of the country. And obviously, I mean, people have lived in North America for thousands and thousands of years. And people are living in New England, 13,000 years ago. As soon as the Ice Age ended, the Native Americans came here and were living here for thousands of years. But, when the Puritans came here, they came here in the early 1600s, like Boston, they came to Plymouth in 1620. Boston's founded 1630. Salem's founded 1626. So for the United States, that's pretty old, right? That's old. And the Puritans were basically like from the late Renaissance. Like when you think of people like Benjamin Franklin or George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, like that was kind of like the Enlightenment. They believed in science, rationalism. Puritans came from the Renaissance. It's a very different worldview. It's a very magical worldview of how they viewed things. And I often like to think of it that like some of the people who settled New England in the early 1600s, they could have seen Shakespeare's plays performed live on stage for the very first time, right? And so that's like a different time. It's a very different time. And then when they came over here, they brought a lot of their beliefs with them. For example, the Puritans who settled in Massachusetts and Connecticut came mostly from a part of England called East Anglia. And East Anglia was the site of the biggest witch hunts in England. That's where Matthew Hopkins, the witch finder general, was. He's sort of a famous historical figure. And so when the Puritans came to New England from East Anglia, they basically brought their witchcraft beliefs with them to this part of the country. And so they brought like a lot of beliefs about witches, ghosts, and also the devil were kind of those are their main components of their folklore that they brought over here. And so, it has like Massachusetts and New England has like 400 years of like weird history, basically, which some other parts of the country don't have. So I think that adds to the general vibe that some of these horror writers pick up on,
Well, not only that, I mean, you have the Salem witch trials and, all sorts of wild things going on then, with people supposedly practicing witchcraft. But I've even read where there have been even earlier UFO sightings in New England when the Puritans came over and everything.
Yeah.
Think about that. That's really fascinating.
The first UFO sighting, which I was often called like the first UFO sighting in North America. I don't know how you would prove that, but Governor John Winthrop, who was the governor of Massachusetts in the 1640s, kept a really detailed diary. And in his diary, I want to say it's like 1644 perhaps, or 1641, somewhere around there, like a long time ago. Mm-hmm. He talks about these two men who are in a rowboat and they're rowing down the Muddy River. And the Muddy River is just a river here. It's like, a couple miles from where I am right now. They're rowing down the Muddy River at night. And in the sky above them, they see this strange light appear. And the light changes shape as they look at it. Like sometimes it looks like an arrow. Sometimes it looks like a giant pig. Sometimes it just like a glowing light and things like this. So they watch this light for a while. And then the light disappears. And then the men realize that they have moved against the current several miles up the river and have no recollection of doing it. So like somehow their little rowboat has gone against the current of this river miles. And they're like, what the heck happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost like it's an early UFO encounter, but also it's almost like a missing time. Early missing time story as well, because somehow they don't know how they moved several miles and they're only looking at this glowing thing for like a few minutes. And so it's interesting, like, and John Winthrop was, the governor, just writing down things about taxes and trade and, whatever, warfare, the things that were, part of his job. At the same time, he included things like that in his diary, which is really interesting that you can go back and read that. And he just accepted that, like, yeah, this is just happening. The world is full of strange things to him. It was no surprise necessarily,
Yeah, definitely eye-opening, so to speak, I guess you could say, for the Puritans or, the settlers up there. It's hard to say how many actual accounts of UFOs have been in the Northeast in the 1600s, 1700s. But tell us a little bit about the Salem witch trials. I mean, that's a fascinating subject of what's happened. There's a great history there.
There is. And I'll just, when I talk about witches, I want to be really clear that I'm not talking about like modern witches, right? I'm not talking about people who, worship the earth or, work with crystals and herbs, or the nice people who read your tarot cards on the weekend or whatever. I'm not talking about those witches. I'm not talking about the modern kind of Wiccan style witches. I'm using it in like a classical sense of the term. It's like a witch is someone who uses magic to harm somebody.
Right.
And I will say there were no real witches in the Salem witch trials. I'm just gonna come right out and say there were no real witches in the Salem witch trials. A lot of it was politics and concern about sex and gender and things like that. So, I mean, the Puritans, when they came over here they came here in, let's say, 1620, the first ones came. By 1641, they put a law on the books that made witchcraft a capital crime punishable by death. So that was in 1641. The first woman executed in Massachusetts was a woman named Margaret Jones, who lived in Charlestown, Massachusetts, which is now part of Boston. She was executed in 1648. She was an herbal healer who, her cures were really effective. Like, they were very simple. People say it was things like anise seed crushed up in brandy and things like this. And her cures were really effective, which made people suspicious almost. Like, how come her cures are so effective? Like, maybe she's actually using witchcraft on us to heal us. And well, other people thought, well, maybe she's actually using witchcraft to make us sick just so she can sell us these medicines. And so, the gossip and whatever led to a trial, and she was executed. Her husband was also accused of witchcraft, but he was not found guilty, and he, got the hell out of Massachusetts. He's like, I'm done with this craziness, wisely. But it's, between, let's say, 1641 and 1692, when the Salem witch trials happened, 5 women were executed in Massachusetts, and 6 women were executed in Connecticut. And it's interesting, like, men were also accused of witchcraft, but it tended to be women more who were found guilty and executed. And some of that is because there was just a gender role. A lot of the women, transgressed what they thought women should be doing at the time. They were too argumentative. Maybe they had sex before marriage. Maybe Margaret Jones, the healer, maybe she was a rival of male physicians, right? That happened in some other cases. A case in Lynn, Massachusetts, a woman was a healer and a physician was like, no, you're stepping on my business. I'm going to accuse you of being a witch, basically, to try to take away the competition. So there had been a few witch trials, but then in 1692, the Salem witch trials happened, which was huge. 150 people are accused of being witches. 19 people are executed, so 14 women and 5 men. And then 1 man is crushed to death while being tortured also. So 20 people are killed. And, it was so much larger than the other ones, all the other trials that had happened before, that a lot of historians have been like, why were the Salem witch trials so much larger than these small single witch trials we saw? And I mean, there were a few different reasons. Some of them were definitely political. I think, Salem Village and Salem Town, where it basically happened, there was a lot of infighting within that community around, like, the people in Salem Village wanted to break away from Salem Town and found their own kind of settlement, but some people didn't want to do that. They had, ties to the larger town. That was part of it. There had also been a lot of Native American attacks on the fringes of the colonies at this time. So like Maine, a lot of settlements were burned, a lot of people were massacred. And so a lot of refugees from Maine had come down and settled in the Salem area. And they were telling these horror stories of like seeing people burned alive and the, villages being destroyed and things like this. And so the Puritans thought that this was actually the devil's work, right? That the devil was trying to destroy the Puritan colony in North America because they, were xenophobic and didn't understand Native American life. So that was happening at the same time. And finally, there was also like some other, like the charter of the colony had not been renewed by the English king, so they didn't know if the colony would be entirely shut down. So there's all this like pressure building up. And finally, two little girls who lived in the house of the Reverend Samuel Parris, who was the minister in Salem Village, they just started to act strangely. They felt like people were attacking them physically, but they couldn't see them. They were frightened all the time. They started to like speak in tongues. They would bark like dogs. They would do all these things. And, people thought, oh, this is witchcraft. And finally, the devil is now attacking a minister's own family. So this is the final straw. We've got to root out every single witch that we can find in Massachusetts and kind of destroy this conspiracy of witches, which is trying to take over the colony. And so it was, happened at a very particular political moment for certain reasons. And that's why it grew so much also. It's interesting, the judges who were in charge of the Salem witch trials made a few decisions that allowed them to grow to such a huge size. And one of those was that if anybody, all these people were being accused of witches. If you pled guilty and named other people as witches, you were not executed, right? So if Dave Cruz is accused of being a witch, Dave Cruz goes into the courtroom and he says, oh, I'm definitely guilty. I am definitely guilty of witchcraft. And you know what? Russ Bailey's a witch too. They'd be like, okay, sorry, great. Russ. We're going to put you in jail, but we're not going to execute you. Well, let's say Russ Bailey is accused of being a witch. He comes to the courtroom. He says, oh, no, I'm not a witch. I'm totally innocent. They'd be like, you know what? You're lying. You're going to go to the gallows. And so only people who were innocent only people who pled innocent were executed. All the people who pled guilty and named names survived. And so people knew that if they were accused of being a witch, they had to plead guilty and they had to name other people as witches, because otherwise they would be executed. So it just kept growing and growing and growing, because everyone's like, oh yeah, I got to name more witches or else I'm going to the gallows. So I'm going to name my family, I'll name my neighbors. And it just became this like metastasizing cancer of witchcraft accusations, which is crazy. Totally crazy.
I got to ask though.
The jails were just filled up with people who had been accused of witchcraft. There were like 150 people in jail.
That's insane. Peter, is it true that they would actually drown people and say if you float, you're a witch, but if you stay at the bottom, you're not, which means that you're not a witch, but you're still dead.
Right. Yeah. I mean, your soul is saved, but you're dead. I mean, it was called the water test, and it was done mostly in England. There was one case of them doing it in Connecticut. They didn't really do it in the Salem trials, but it was called the water test. And the idea is that water is kind of a purifying substance, right? Water is used in baptism, all of this stuff. And so if you throw a witch into water, the water will reject the witch and the witch will float on top of it. Whereas so that's how you know they're a witch and therefore guilty. But if you throw someone into the water and they sink to the bottom, well, the water has, not rejected them. So therefore they're innocent, but they might just drown before you fish them out of that pond.
Right.
Yeah. So it was a risky way to show that somebody was innocent or guilty. It was done once in Connecticut. I don't know if the person drowned or not. I don't think they did. I think they were pulled out in time, but yeah, crazy. They would often, their main evidence they used during the Salem witch trials was what they called spectral evidence. And again, like let's say, I think I'm being bewitched. And I say things like, I was asleep in my bedroom last night and Dave Cruz materialized in my bedroom and he stabbed me with pins. And then he turned into a snake and hissed at me and said that unless I signed the devil's book, he would come back the next night and torture me again. And no one else would see this, right? Because Dave Cruz is at home in his house, but somehow as a witch, he's able to send out his soul or his specter, as they called it, to cause this trouble, right? It's like astral projection. Witches would basically be astral projecting their souls out all over Salem, all over Massachusetts, and causing this trouble. But no one could see, no one could see Dave Cruz's soul torturing me except me. And so when I do this on in the courtroom, obviously I could be lying. It could have all been a dream. I could have hallucinated, but the judges would take that as legitimate evidence that you were guilty of witchcraft, particularly if other people came forward and said the same thing. And so it was a bad use of evidence. And also people would pile on. Like if someone was unpopular politically, multiple people would come forward and say, oh yeah, Dave Cruz, definitely, he is a witch. I saw him floating around my chimney at night trying to cause trouble and off to the gallows, right? So
I would love to see that, by the way.
I'd love to see myself float too. Not on water.
Terrifying.
Not on
it's
water.
Truly terrifying.
Don't want to float on water. I mean in the air. No,
Yeah.
just that is just amazing how people thought back then. It's truly, perplexing. But I guess they had to do something. To try to figure out. Well, let me ask you this. So have you found any evidence that there were actual witches, real witches, practicing back then and doing some of this stuff in the mix of people who were actually being accused of and innocently and dying?
No, I haven't. But what I will say is that a lot of people did practice magic then.
Yes.
It was a time when people had magical worldview. And so you will see a lot of people did practice magic of various kinds. So certainly some of the magic that they practice is still familiar to us, like astrology or palm reading or things like that. So if you were a merchant and you wanted to figure out the best day to sail, to the Caribbean for rum or sugar or whatever, you might go to an astrologer and the astrologer would check the charts and be like, oh yeah, you should sail on Saturday the 14th. That is the day for your ship to sail. It's a good day. That's, they do things like that. They would also do simple fortune telling to particularly young people to try to figure out who they would marry, so there are different types of things. Like they would, there was this trick they did called the Venus glass, where you fill a glass full of water and then you drop an egg white into the water. And the egg white's just going to float around and form these weird shapes. And depending on what the shapes you see in the water sort of says what your husband or wife would do for work. So it was usually young women looking to find a husband. Like, I see a ship in that egg white, I'm going to marry a sailor. I see a plow, I'm going to marry a farmer. I see a book, I'm going to marry, a minister or something like that. There was an interesting story where a young woman did this. And then when she looked into the egg white, she saw a coffin, which meant that she was going to die before she got married. And so supposedly she died before she got married. But so people do sort of that type of magic. There was a lot of magic also intended to defend against witches, you see more stories about people trying to defend against witches than you see stories about people that might actually be doing witchcraft, So even today, people will still nail horseshoes above a door with the points up, right? And say, oh, it's for luck, right? It's to keep the luck in. That originally was used to keep witches from entering your house. That was the intention, was to prevent a witch from entering your house. There's something about the horseshoe and the metal that was supposed to be
iron.
Probably iron, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a great story from Newbury, Massachusetts. It's now Newburyport, this part of it. A woman named Elizabeth Morse was suspected of being a witch. This is in the 1660s. And one of her neighbors was terrified. I'm really afraid of Elizabeth Morse. I don't want her to come into my house. So she nailed a horseshoe up above her door. one of this woman's neighbors was a very devout Puritan, and he came over. He's like, "No, don't you put that horseshoe up above your door. That's magic, and all magic comes from the devil. Even if you think it's white magic, it still comes from the devil." So he pulls down the horseshoe.
Wow.
Until then, Elizabeth Morse goes into her neighbor's house to see, how she's doing, and then that woman gets sick and dies like a few days later. And so, like, oh, clearly Elizabeth Morse is a witch, and if we had just kept that horseshoe up, like, that woman would not have died. I've also seen a story from Vermont, and this is from the 19th century, right? So the 1800s, so much later, where there's a blacksmith who suspects one of his neighbors is a witch. And so he's like the blacksmith is working his barn, whatever, doing his smithing stuff. And then the neighbor comes in to talk. And the blacksmith nails a horseshoe up over the door while the neighbor's inside the barn. And the neighbor can't get out of the barn. He sits there for like hours and hours until the blacksmith finally takes down the horseshoe. And then the neighbor suspected of being a witch is able to leave. Like, suddenly the iron is gone. And again, it's just a folk story, but it sort of shows like how people viewed the power of this. And they would use iron tools for other things. Like, I've read about a man, his name is like Zerubbabel Endicott, which is a fantastic name. But he buried like a metal harpoon underneath, I think it was the front door of his house, or in the fireplace, one or the other, like one of the openings of the house. And that was intended to keep a witch out, because there's a big hunk of metal like buried to keep a witch from entering the house. So they're very concerned about that sort of thing. I will say also the grossest probably form of anti-witchcraft magic people practice, at least gross to us, is something called the witch bottle. I don't know if you've ever heard of a witch bottle. Basically, the theory behind a witch bottle is that when a witch enchants somebody or casts a spell on them, a connection is made between the two people. So if Dave Cruz casts an evil spell on Russ Bailey, like, there's a connection made. Dave is sending evil magic through this connection to Russ. And that connection affects every part of Russ. It affects his hair, it affects his teeth, whatever. It even affects his urine, okay? And so what people would do, they would take the urine of the person they thought was bewitched, they put it in a bottle, and then they would put in nails, they would put in other sharp things like that. And the theory is that there's this connection between Dave and Russ, or Dave and even Russ's urine. And by putting the nails like into the urine and whatever, it's going to send pain back along that magical connection to the witch, back to Dave. So you're going to feel this pain of these nails being stuck into the urine. And so then maybe you'll come to Russ's house and be like, oh, what's going on here? Like, trying to find out why you're feeling this pain. And if you show up, people will be like, oh, clearly he's the witch. In a more extreme case, people would even take these witch bottles, these bottles of urine, and they would put in the nails and maybe pins and thorns or whatever. Then they put it in the fireplace and just heat it up until it exploded. And so, like, don't try this at home. Like, you don't want a bottle of exploding urine and nails at home. But that was probably even supposed to kill the witch. Like, it would send this fiery explosive force back through the connection, just kill the witch dead, So there's a great story from New Hampshire. I think it's is it Wentworth, New Hampshire? I can't remember the exact town. This guy named Simeon Smith, who, this is the 1770s. It's the American Revolution. And Simeon Smith is very pro-America, right? He's a patriot, he's a revolutionary. He's also a witch. And he cast a spell on one of his neighbor's children, and this because they are British sympathizers. So he casts a spell on their son, and the son goes blind and becomes very sick. And so this family of British sympathizers is like, oh, you know what? This is Simeon Smith. We know it's Simeon Smith. And so they take some urine, and they may actually take some blood as well from their son who is sick and blind. They put it in a bottle, and they put in the cork, and they put in the nails. But then the cork pops out. You're like, okay, this is weird. Like, the cork popped out. Simeon Smith is probably a more powerful witch than we thought. And so then, like, they put it in the fire, let's say. But then the fire goes up, like, okay, Simeon Smith is really a powerful witch. So finally, they take the bottle of blood and urine, they put in the cork, they stick a knife into it until the knife goes through the cork and into the blood and urine, and then they put that in the fire, and it cooks, and the blood and urine bubbles up and hits the blade, and Simeon Smith drops dead. And so, like, okay, clearly, the magic worked. Like, Simeon Smith is gone, and the son supposedly is cured from the blindness and the disease. So, wow. Like, a great story. Is it true? I don't know if it's true, but witchcraft stories like this, they're often a way to explain misfortune. Like, bad things are happening to you. How do you explain it? Why am I suffering, but my neighbor is not suffering, right? Why is my kid sick, but my neighbor's kid is not sick? Why are my crops failing, whatever? And since there was not a scientific mindset at the time, they didn't understand, bacteria or viruses or whatever like that. They would just be like, okay, it's probably a witch. A witch is doing this to me. And who is the witch? Usually the witch is somebody in the neighborhood that you fought with. It was almost always somebody that you knew. It was usually, someone you fought with over property or something like that. So it's interesting. If you look at Ireland, for example, Ireland had a lot of belief in fairies. And in Ireland, there were very few witchcraft trials, and no one was really executed for witchcraft because they would blame their misfortune on fairies, right? Mm. Your child is sick, it's because you offended a fairy. Crop is failing, you did something to the fairies. England, fairy belief not so strong, they would blame it on witches instead. So,
yeah, Ireland. I have noticed that Ireland has a lot of folklore. Of course, you have the leprechauns, you have the fae, and you have banshees as well. And
right.
A lot of interesting folklore and legends. I like listening and hearing about those. Russ, was there anything that you wanted to add to that or comment?
Well, I kind of want to shift gears a little bit.
Sure.
Ask about a creature we encountered back in we didn't encounter it, but we saw pictures of it. My team and I did a residential paranormal investigation back in the summer, and the client that we had spoke with on the mantelpiece, there was a small figure of something that was we couldn't describe what it was, but there was nothing there. We seem to think it was an entity called the Pukwudgie.
Oh yeah.
So those are nasty.
What can you tell? Yeah, what can you tell us about where do they come from? What do they do? What do they want?
Sure. That's interesting. So that's a good segue from talking about Irish fairies. I would say when the Puritans came here to New England, they were like, oh, there were no fairies here. They were like, no fairies in New England. There's nothing. You read Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, he even says there are no fairies in New England. They're gone. They never existed. And that kind of belief persisted here for a long time. What the Puritans didn't understand, because they were not really curious about these things, they didn't understand that the Native Americans here had told stories about sort of magical creatures in the woods for many, many years, for thousands of years probably. And so the Native Americans here from all the states had these stories about creatures who live in the woods, who are often small, covered in long hair, often shy, right? They don't really want to be seen by people. They're kind of reclusive. And some of them can be tricky. Some of them can be malevolent. Some of them can be helpful, but it really depends how you treat them, whether you treat them with respect. And, so they're kind of morally ambivalent, these creatures that live out in the woods. And they had many different names for them in the different languages, which I will really try not to say too much because I will mispronounce them. They would words like Hiawatha or Nakamwasug, these kind of long Algonquin names for these creatures. So this is happening, but the kind of English speaking culture doesn't really pay attention to it for many years because the Puritans were concerned about getting rid of the Native Americans and taking over the land, basically. So they didn't really care about that stuff. In the 19th century, the poet Longfellow writes a famous poem called Song of Hiawatha. It's a big hit in the 19th century, right? People didn't have TV or movies, so they read epic poems. And in this poem, which was a bestseller, he talks about Pukwudgies. And he got that term from the Ojibwa people who live in the upper kind of Midwest parts of Canada, right? Native Americans from there. But Longfellow lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so he starts to talk about Pukwudgies, and he's from Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the Pukwudgies, that these creatures are, I think they determine something like little rushing ones, right? Or little fast ones or something like that. So they're these small, little hairy creatures who are a little bit malevolent, right? I think they try to take care of Hiawatha and try to take him down and things like that. So Longfellow talks about them. Shortly after that, people in Massachusetts start to talk about Pukwudgies being here in Massachusetts. Like somebody, I think it's the history of the town of Easton, Massachusetts. The author of that basically steals something from the Song of Hiawatha and puts it right in this town history and says, oh, this happened in Easton, Massachusetts. It didn't, right? It's lifted directly from Song of Hiawatha, but he has it in there. And so the term Pukwudgie is introduced into New England, into this area, and it's, let's face it, it's easier for an English speaker to say than some of the traditional Algonquin terms from this area, like Namakamwasug is a long word to say versus Pukwudgie, which is easy to say, it's kind of fun to say. And then finally, in like 1936, I want to say 1936, in the 1930s, a woman named Elizabeth Renard, she is a folklorist, and she's interviewing these two Wampanoag men who live in Cape Cod. So, Native American men from Cape Cod, for a book she's writing about Cape Cod folklore. And they tell her stories about these little creatures, these little humanoids who are somewhat malevolent, and they use the term Pukwudgies. And so that it's kind of come full circle. Like now, even the Native Americans in the area are using the word Pukwudgie, at least these that she talked about. And so from Elizabeth Renard's book, the term really became popular and used widely. And so you do hear a lot of stories from this area about Pukwudgies, I think. It's most people tell stories about them as being sort of somewhat malevolent or dangerous. I've had some people tell me stories where they're not. I think it's interesting, like it depends who's telling the story, I guess. Like there's a place down in Freetown, Massachusetts called the Freetown State Forest, which is a big park, thousands of acres. And it's just kind of, as you can tell from the title, it's a forest. But there's a ledge there called the Sonnet Ledge. It's this ledge that overlooks a pond. It's a big, tall, rocky ledge. And people see a lot of strange things on that ledge. But one thing that supposedly lurks there are the Pukwudgies. And people say if you go to this ledge, a Pukwudgie may just kind of push you off to your death, because quite a few people apparently died falling off this ledge. So Some people blame that on Pukwudgies. And a few people have reported seeing Pukwudgies in the Freetown State Forest. And they say they look like kind of these small little men covered in long gray hair, often with these dog-like noses. And there's a great book by a guy named Christopher Balzano. The book is called Dark Forest, which is just stories from the Freetown State Forest. But he has two people in that book who tell stories about seeing Pukwudgies. And in both cases, they see this creature in the woods, and they don't really interact with it. They kind of back away and realizing something is off here, so they back away from the creature. But then the creature shows up like outside their house at night. They see it in their driveway, or they see it looking in the window or things like that. And finally, it only ends when they move away from the area. When they move away from the forest, the connection with that Pukwudgie ends, someone did write to me and tell me about a Pukwudgie story, which was not scary. And it's interesting because they were of Native American descent. And so they were living in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is a large industrial city here in Massachusetts. It's a dense place, right? It's not a wilderness by any means. But this woman wrote to me and she said when she was a girl, her grandparents lived in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And so this girl and her cousins would often go visit their grandparents, and they were of Native American descent. And so one day the girl is sitting on the sofa in the living room with her grandparents. I think they're watching TV or something. And the girl feels somebody pull on her hair. And so she kind of turns around and there's nobody behind her. It's just like empty space behind the couch. So she turns back to TV. Then she feels it again. She turns around, there's nobody there. She feels it a third time, she turns around real quick and she sees this little old lady who's like 3 feet tall with gray hair down to her feet is standing behind her, pulling on this girl's hair. And the girl screams and the little old lady disappears. And the grandparents are like, what are you screaming about? Little girl, what's going on? The girl's like, oh, I saw this little old woman. She was pulling my hair. And the grandparents like, no, you didn't see that. That didn't happen. Don't talk about that. That didn't happen. Right. And so the little girl and her cousins talk, and they realize that the grandparents often will leave food around the house, like, bowls of milk or bowls of food on the floor, but they don't have any pets, right? There's no cat, there's no dog living in this house. And they start to think, oh, maybe there are some little spirits or something living in this house with our grandparents.
Yeah.
And they get confirmation one day, the girl and her cousins, when they come home from the movies and they go to their grandparents' house. And the grandparents' car was not in the driveway. And so they think, okay, probably nobody's home, but we're going to see if our grandparents are in anyway. So they kind of knock on the door, nobody answers. And then they peer in the window into the living room, and they see this little old lady who's 3 feet high with hair down to her feet, and this little old man with like hair down to his feet, who's like 3 feet high, kind of rushing around inside the house very quickly.
Wow.
And they realize that their grandparents have these spirit beings who are living with them in the house, but they're not malevolent, right? They're not malevolent. They are in tune with the family. So it was an interesting story. I was really grateful that this person sent it to me. And it's interesting that it takes place in Lawrence, which is this big modern industrial place, but they were attached to the family apparently.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Yeah, that's really something. Peter, we're slowly reaching the top of the hour. Why don't you tell us where we can find more about you and all your adventures and everything?
Sure. I think the best place to find me is my blog, newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com. So that's probably the best place you can find me. You can also pick up my new book, Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts. That's available on pretty much any place you buy books online, Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, Bookshop, Books A Million, all those places. Those are the best places to find me.
Very cool.
Well, before we leave, I mean, we do got a few more minutes. I did want to ask about, since we're on cryptids, if Peter can talk a little bit about the Goat Man.
Oh, yeah. I will say I do like a Goat Man story, right?
Yes.
So
yeah, definitely.
I found 3 Goat Man stories from New England. Not a ton, but 3. So that's pretty good. One of them is from Jericho, Vermont, a town in Vermont. And this was written down by a guy named Joseph Citro, who is a great writer from Vermont. And basically it's very simple that some developers in the 1960s were building some new homes in Jericho, Vermont. And the people living in that development kept seeing this goat-like man looking in their windows. And, he was kind of goat from the waist down, maybe had horns, and he would just come up to the window and look and run off. And that's all it was. Very simple little story. And it just only lasted for a brief period of time. And some people say he maybe went off to the woods or something, but people there would see this goat man when the development first started. So that's the first one. The second one was from the 1970s, and it's from Sandwich, Massachusetts, which is down in Cape Cod, and it's from the 1970s. And an 11-year-old boy is at home, and he's watching TV in his parents' house. It's December. It's a snowy day outside. And his parents are out doing errands, and so this boy is home alone. He's looking at the TV, and the TV is on the other side of the room, and above the TV is a window. So he's kind of sitting there watching TV, whatever it is, like Creature Double Feature or cartoons or whatever's on, like he's watching this. And at one point he glances up and he sees, looking in the window, this hairy humanoid face is looking in the window at him. And so the boy, screams bloody murder. And then the thing looking in the window screams bloody murder too and kind of runs off. And the boy is naturally freaked out, as you would be. I'd be freaked out if this happened to me. It's the 1970s. Nobody has a cell phone, so he can't call his parents. So he calls his friends and he's like, did you guys pull a prank on me? Did one of you put on this ape mask or whatever and come over? They're like, no, we didn't. And it's obvious because you're reaching us at home, we didn't do it. And so the boy's like, can you come over? Because I'm too afraid to see what's outside. So the boy's friends come over. And they all get up their courage and they all go out in the backyard, which is where the creature had been, to see what they could see. So they go out in the backyard, it's covered in snow, and they see these footprints leading away from the house going off into the woods. But the footprints are cloven hooves. So they're not like a Bigfoot footprint, they're cloven goat hooves going off into the woods, which I find a little creepy, right? It's kind of like that twist ending or something there, which is good, I think, which makes it a good story. The last one, I know this is my third and final Goatman story I know, comes from a town in Cherryfield, Maine. So the town of Cherryfield, Maine is a small town up in Maine. And I think this one's from the 1950s. So a guy is up in Maine in Cherryfield. He's driving his pickup truck down this road through the woods. It's very woodsy up there, lots of pine trees, right? It's the woods. He's driving his road, listening to the radio in his pickup truck. And suddenly his engine dies and his radio dies. And it's like the car has just died. So the guy's like, darn. He gets out of his truck. He lifts up the hood to try to see what's wrong. He's looking, he can't see anything wrong. The engine looks totally fine. As he's looking at the engine, he sees this man emerge from the trees on the side of the road and step into the middle of the road. And from the, he's got wearing like a red flannel shirt because it's Maine and it's cold.
Right.
But then he's got a beard. He has like these small horns. And from the waist down, he just has goat legs. And so this goat man is standing in the middle of the road and he just kind of smiles at the guy who's looking at his truck, gives him like this creepy smile. And the guy who's trying to fix his truck is totally freaked out. And then the goat man just crosses the road and goes back into the other side of the forest and disappears. And then the guy's truck engine starts right up and the radio comes back on and the guy gets in the truck and just drives the hell out of there. And so that's the third goat man story. And I like that one because it got almost that like UFO, like disrupting your electrical system aspect to it, Yeah. And the red flannel shirt is good because obviously it's Maine. You're not going to run around with your shirt off. It's too cold. And I think there have been some other paranormal entities seen with red flannel shirts sometimes too. So, yeah.
Those are great stories, Peter. I really appreciate you, taking the time to come out. And I want to extend the invitation. Please come on the show anytime. We'd love to have you back. And, we'll get you booked in for sometime in the next year. Sure.
That'd be great. Yeah. I have a lot of weird stories to share. So I'm always happy to find somebody who's willing to listen.
This is the place to listen to those stories and tell them.
Definitely.
Fantastic.
Great. Yeah, this was fun. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thanks again. And one more time, would you please let the audience know where they can find you and everything that's you?
Sure. You can find me at my blog, which is newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com. So that's newenglandfolklore, one word, .blogspot.com. And you can also find my newest book, Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, anywhere you buy books online. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Bookshop, any place like that.
Awesome. Thanks again, Peter. Russ Bailey, where can everyone find you?
Facebook, Black Sky Paranormal, Twitter at @BSky_paranormal. You can also follow me on TikTok and Instagram at Black Sky UFO, Beyonders Crew on Facebook, and of course, BeyondTheStrange.com.
Indeed, BeyondTheStrange.com is where it's at. And we do have a calendar there, so if you want to know what's coming up in the future, you definitely want to go there and check things out. All the links are there for chat and all kinds of stuff. Plus, we're going to have the eTalk links as well. You want to check that out as well and get hooked up there. Thanks again, Peter. Hang out for a second. We're going to just close the show. Beyond the Strange is owned and copyrighted by Dave Cruz. It cannot be simulcast, rebroadcasted, or copied without written consent of Beyond the Strange. Also, the views and opinions are not necessarily that of Beyond the Strange, hosts, guests, and affiliated networks. Listeners are always encouraged to conduct your research and formulate your own opinions. Executive producer and creator of Beyond the Strange is Dave Cruz. Co-executive producer is Deb J. Cruz. Producer is Russ Bailey. Disclaimer and voice work is by Casper Parks. Visit him at casperparks.com. Music is by Alan Hall and Zebrafish. Visit soundcloud.com/Zebrafish. And thanks again to everyone reposting in Twitter and Facebook and everyone in the chat. Remember, follow and subscribe and like on both Twitch and YouTube, and tell a friend about the show. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great Thanksgiving. We'll see you on PAP next month. And until then, everyone, stay strange. Hasta.